have Luis and Michelle talk about regular expressions are hard. There you go.
Hello, everyone hear me? Yes? Great. All right. Hi, I'm Louis Michael. Everyone calls me Misha. Today we're going to talk about Regex are hard decision-making difficulties and risks in programming regular expressions. So let's dive right into it. The first idea we have here is that regular expressions are a concept that has been used a lot in formal languages and is probably understood well from a formal languages perspective for most people in the room. But it's also a key tool used in software engineering by real developers. But at times, real developers find this difficult. They believe, simply put, that regular expressions are hard, and that regular expressions are hard to test, hard to validate, specifically very hard to master. So we're going to dive into kind of the nitty-gritty of the difficulties real people face with regular expressions. So the research community has already done a fair amount of investigation associated with regular expression usage. Around a third of all projects use regular expressions. Regular expressions also pose serious security risks. So this is known as REDOS, or stands for Regular Expression Denial of Service. And in principle, this is when a regular expression can be paired with malicious input to consume a large amount of resources, and this can cause a DOS vector. So this has been seen in both Stack Overflow and Cloudflare outages in recent memory. We've also had some investigations into regular expression from a quantitative perspective. So feature usage, testing practices, and even evolution of regular expressions over a period of a couple of years. And this has produced a lot of interesting insights about how developers use regular expressions and what real regular expressions look like. But it doesn't really put the developer at the center of this discussion. Real people end up writing these regular expressions, and sometimes they make mistakes, and they definitely find difficulties. But current literature doesn't really focus on the people involved in the process very strongly. So that's what we did. For the paper, we proposed 5 research questions: perceptions, decisions, difficulties, handling mechanisms for those difficulties, and risks associated with regular expressions. But today, we're just going to be talking about the middle 3, purely based on time. This is also the bulk of the qualitative investigation that we handled. So let's start with So for the purposes of asking questions associated with regular expressions, we broke the process up into 4 steps. Choosing a solution, proposing a regular expression, validating a regular expression, and finally documenting it. And this is how we discussed each of these with developers and proposed questions for our insights. So, what did we end up actually doing? We knew that we wanted to take a survey and put it out to a variety of developers. But a difficulty with this, with the target audience of the survey, is that developers are highly paid people that are not necessarily easy to reach. So we knew that if we were going to have a large response rate, we needed to also keep our survey relatively short. So we were targeting about 15 minutes. We also knew that we wanted to address regular expressions both as proposing new regular expressions, but also reusing regular expressions. So this notion that sometimes when faced with a string matching problem and deciding to take a regular expression, you might investigate existing solutions to your problem and then travel down the path of reusing one of those existing solutions. So you might try to phrase your problem using English language and go to Stack Overflow, find some of those other problems. That notion of reuse of regular expressions. So we went about piloting our survey questions. And we found that some worked, some didn't. But at the end of the day, we ended up with 2 distinct instruments for our investigation. And a lot of this had to do with timing. We had a lot of stuff we wanted to ask. We wanted to keep individual surveys short, so we ended up with two distinct instruments. One had a specific emphasis on reuse. Then we went about distributing the instruments. So, survey number 1, as it's referred to in the paper, is 121 survey responses from one large media company. And survey number 2 is a little bit more complicated in its distribution, but it had 158 survey responses. It was distributed in 2 large bins of response rates. So first was through professional contacts or personal contacts. This is the authors all took a chance to reach out to people that they knew were professional developers, and they asked them to take the survey. They also asked them if they felt comfortable doing so to provide that instrument to other professional developers they knew in a snowball method. So that was bin number 1 for survey distribution, and bin number 2 for the survey was it was distributed at popular developer communities online. So we distributed it to both Hacker News and several subreddits that were both computer science focused and also allowed surveys. This is the instrument that had a specific emphasis on reuse. Combined, we saw a total of 279 responses to our survey instrument, which felt great. But after looking at everything, we still had follow-up questions that we wanted to ask and clarification and even further investigation into the ideas that we started to dig into in the surveys. So we prompted 17 follow-up interviews, and these were people that at the end of the surveys had just had indicated that they were willing to be contacted for further investigation. Finally, we took all of the text associated with both the free response questions from all of the surveys and also the transcripts of the 17 interviews, and we performed open coding, and that's how we end up with the insights we're talking about. So, what exactly did we learn? We're going to start by talking about the decisions developers make. So, when choosing a solution, the key decision point for a lot of developers is problem complexity. This is a kind of Goldilocks notion. Developers felt that some problems were best solved simply using string matching built-in APIs. Something like split on comma is best solved maybe using the split function in your Java API or whatever supported in your appropriate programming language. It's not necessarily useful to use a regular expression. It feels a little bit like overkill in most cases. But on the flip side of this problem, there are tasks that felt far too complex to be solved by regular expressions because developers felt that the regular expression would become too cumbersome in order to express what they were looking for. In these cases, what might feel more appropriate is a more complete parsing tool, something that you might develop in Antler. When composing regular expressions, developers felt that a key point was matching too much versus matching too little. One developer in an interview said, "I'd much rather match too little than match too much to avoid introducing garbage data." We saw that individuals had different weightings for false positives and false negatives associated with matching behavior of the regular expressions based on use case. So here for validation, this person felt that a false positive was weighted significantly higher than a false negative. In validation, we saw trusted reuse as a key decision point for developers. This is fairly intuitive, but very interesting. The idea that you may attempt to personally validate your regular expression that you found through some additional use case less if you felt that you had trust in the source that you found it from. So if you found a highly upvoted Stack Overflow post, you might feel that your validation skills wouldn't be as high as maybe someone who posted that and the reception that they got from it and as a result, you might try less or believe that it is more valuable than if you composed yourself. A little bit on the flip side of this, some developers also had distinct distrust of reuse scenarios because they felt they didn't understand it well enough. And in those cases, they might test more heavily in an attempt to understand the regular expression they were using. Okay. And then finally, in documentation, this boils down a lot to personal opinion, but also some of complexity. So developers felt at times that regular expressions were a concise way of expressing the string matching behavior that they were looking for, and as a result, were described as more self-documented, but also, in some cases, regular expressions felt very complex, or they became cumbersome, and in those scenarios, developers felt that it may be best to break the regular expression up over multiple lines, kind of decompose the problem, and also provide documentation for those stylistics. So these are some of the decisions we found throughout our investigation. There are more addressed in the paper. All right, moving on to difficulties in handling mechanisms associated with regular expressions. So here we didn't see quite as clear cut across the 4 stages the emphasis. We mostly saw difficulties and then associated handling mechanisms in both composition and validation, but we also saw some issues that were impacting the whole process. So, regarding composition, past developers felt that they struggled with the idea of searching for reuse candidates. It is at times, for developers, difficult to express their string matching problem in a way that they feel they can search for it. It's not necessary, in some cases, it might be simple as saying, I would like to find an email regular expression. But in other cases, it is not as easily put into words what your task is, and as a result, needing to do that in order to find potential reuse candidates can be distinctly difficult for developers. To combat this problem, developers worked to decompose the regular expression, and they also worked to have personal libraries of regular expression. So this is the idea that they would first break up the problem into meaningful subcomponents, and then they would also, if they felt that they had a regular expression they thought might then solve a problem for them again later down the road, they would document it and essentially reuse it in the future. Right. Validation. Developers fought with edge cases and understanding edge cases of regular expressions. In some cases, developers felt at this point they did not fully understand the problem, and as a result, they might try to test all available input that was provided to them as sample data, or they might try to generate their own input. And finally, in cross-cutting issues that we're going to discuss today, is the notion of understanding the regular expression on the whole. This is the notion that it's just hard to use regular expressions. That's the notion of the paper. And developers specifically tend to have difficulties with the terse syntax associated with regular expressions. So reading them, even if they had written them, might still be challenging. A key insight here is that what was called out was tool support, but not necessarily tool support that the research community has already been addressing. A key tool that is being researched is input generation, but this input generation tends to focus a lot on regular expressions as a formal language construct and not necessarily as a tool for developers. It goes for edge or node coverage on the graph of the regular expression. But what developers found useful was visualization and highlighting of their using syntax highlighters, which are frequently online tools that are not necessarily well studied in existing literature. They also would, again, attempt to break down, decompose the regular expression into understandable segments. So these are, again, a highlight of the findings from the total paper associated with difficulties in handling some regular expressions. Right. Let's move forward to discussion. So there's a myriad of implications associated with some of our findings because we went out and talked to real people. So across the 4 steps. First, we talked a little bit about the notion of sometimes developers choose regular expression, sometimes they choose other approaches. But this problem space and the alternatives, and specifically this inflection point, this decision, isn't necessarily very well studied, and there's an opportunity to investigate the general problem space and the mapping of that problem space. In composition, this is the first of a couple of steps we're going to highlight as great usage of tools in validating, or an opportunity to develop great. So, developers discuss wanting to use metrics when choosing between reuse candidates, and they might rank something as more or less valuable based on that. So, they tend towards maybe shorter regular expressions and those that had fewer features associated with them. They also discussed having difficulty searching, so something like a semantic-based regular expression, so search support, is well motivated here. And then IDE support is also well motivated. When it is available, it was called out exceedingly positively in interviews, but it's not widely supported. Most of tool usage for regular expressions is in syntax highlighters, which are frequently online tools. Bringing this into the IDE is potentially very helpful. With validation, we've already discussed a little bit about input generation, but again, this doesn't necessarily put the developer first. So a notion of input generation that is easily understood by humans has strong motivation here. We don't need to see thousands of inputs in order to well understand a regular expression. Finally, on the notion of tool usage, we have documentation, automated documentation for regular expressions. So we have some notion of how developers document regular expressions, and we can scale this out. And then in cross-cutting, we should really take a step back and ask why regular expressions. They're a notion that is difficult for developers to understand, and there's potential for lots of other tools or different approaches to this general problem that are worth investigating. In summary, we're a research effort that puts the developer at the center. We use 2 survey instruments, one with an emphasis on reuse. We've also conducted a series of follow-up surveys. We had a variety of findings, followed by immediate implications. Thank you so much, and I'm ready for questions.
All right, questions?
Yeah. Max Iveta, University of Tanya, thank you for the great work. Among the factors that can influence difficulties in using a regular expression, there may be the choice of the programming language.
Yes.
For instance, I'm a programmer since a very long time, and the reason why I'm not switching yet to other languages is that because I don't have the same great built-in support for handling the regular expression as in Perl, in Python and Java, is not the same.
Mm-hmm. So that's true, and there's actually, this is a great opportunity to call up the next talk, which is specifically about comparing and contrasting the generalizability of some of these findings, or specifically quantitative findings in regular expression usage across languages. So I think a lot of that is going to actually be addressed very shortly. So, yeah.
Very good. What do we set up while we are waiting?